Man, we don't need a calendar to tell us it's summertime here in the desert. A blistering hot day, and it's turned into a very toasty night out there in the Mojave. Good night for you and me to stay indoors, either with the AC cranked on or, if you live in more temperate places, a window open to allow the breezes to waft inside. But don't open that window too far. Strange things lurk outside and are known to be on the prowl during Coast to Coast's prime time, things that have been known to go much further than a mere bump in the night. And we're going to talk about some of them over the next few hours. Nick Redfern has been my guest a couple of times in recent years on this program, and he never fails to get the juices flowing because he always seems to find new ways to look at what might seem to be well-known material, and tonight will be no exception. We have this idea kind of generated by Spielbergian-themed movies that maybe E.T. is out there just waiting to be our pal. Cute, cuddly aliens here to eat our Reese's Pieces. And for more than 50 years, we've heard these alleged alien editorials delivered to contactees issued by these kindly, benevolent space brethren about how concerned they are for our species and for our planet, admonishing us, sort of like our moms, to take better care of ourselves. But scattered here and there throughout the UFO literature are cases that most certainly are not cute or cuddly. They involve encounters that have proven to be deadly. As Nick writes in the foreword to his latest book, the world of UFOs can be illuminating, stimulating, and enlightening, but that same world is filled with cold-hearted killers that will not think twice about taking you out of circulation. And not all of those cold-hearted killers are human. There have been, if you look at the literature, there have been a lot of strange deaths, unexplained disappearances, plane crashes, dubious suicides, and all manner of foul play associated with this topic. Tonight, starting in Hour 2, Nick Redfern draws on a vast database to tie together a series of events that are downright chilling when viewed in a certain light. It's all included in his new book, Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind, and we'll be joined by Nick in just a little while. First, though, I'll be joined by a fellow journalist, longtime UFO researcher, Lee Spiegel, whose columns and pieces for the Huffington Post are read by millions of people every week. Lee will be speaking next month at the MUFON Symposium, which is focusing this year on UFOs in the media. It's held in New Jersey, just outside of Philadelphia. So Lee is a good fit for that topic, that central theme. He'll be here in a moment to talk about UFOs in the news, including some recent stories he's been working on that I think will sort of reach out and grab you. A couple of other quick news notes before we jump into that, though. Our thoughts go out tonight to Stan Friedman, perhaps the best-known UFO researcher in the world. He's, as you know, I mean, if you ever heard him on this program, and I'm sure you have, he's a tireless, relentless crusader for truth and scientific fairness for the UFO subject. He's been all over the world preaching the gospel, and he's been at it for more than half a century. From what I was told today, Stan suffered a heart attack last night. He is alive, but he's going to be out of action for a while, which, knowing Stan, will probably drive him crazy. As I said, he's been a guest on this program many times. He was here in Las Vegas not long ago. We had a chance to talk over lunch. He's just a great gentleman, an honorable man, and I think we're all sending positive vibes your way, Stan, in case you're listening. I'm guessing that George Noory must have mentioned this next item earlier in the week, but I also wanted to remark about the passing of journalist Terry Hansen, who sadly died in his sleep a couple of days ago. Terry was my guest on this program to talk about UFOs in the media. He wrote an absolutely classic book called The Missing Times, and it's the best of its kind. I mean, nothing else even close. This hard-hitting expose of how the mainstream news media have treated, or rather mistreated, UFOs and paranormal topics over the years, and why it's not really accidental. That book is so good. A couple of years ago, when I was planning on teaching a college course about UFOs and the media, that was going to be the textbook. If you don't have it in your library, you should check it out. But Terry was a young man, and his passing is a surprise. He'll really be missed. Several listeners have written into me about a firefighter who went missing in the Los Padres National Forest. His body was found a few days ago, 2 weeks after he's vanished. And have you heard of any of our broadcasts with Dave Paulides? you know why this case rings a bell with our listeners. The circumstances are eerily similar to what Dave has described in his books, the Missing 411 books. This firefighter was named Mike Herdman, was on a camping trip in the wilderness. When his dog ran away from the campsite, he went after the dog. He was only wearing shorts and a T-shirt, didn't have any shoes on, and he never came back. This is out in the middle of nowhere. It took his fellow camper 2 days to hike out to get help. A massive search ensued. No one could find him. His body was recovered at the bottom of a cliff, hidden under some brush, nearly a mile from where he vanished. No signs of foul play, except this kind of fits the pattern as described in those 411 books, down to a T. Same spot where the body was found had been searched repeatedly, but nothing was found. The dog was found many miles away, safe but confused. Dave Politis told me he is trying to get more information on this case. He thinks it's highly suspicious. His website, he said, had been blowing up after the news broke. We'll have to get Dave back on the program soon to talk about this. Webmaster Tim Binnall and I put together an assortment of oddities and delicacies from recent media reports. It's listed on the Coast website under Naps News. Ever wonder why, if psychics and remote viewers truly do have these gifts, why don't they cash in either at the casinos or in the stock market? Well, it turns out some of them have. We have a story posted on the website. I should mention that the best remote viewers in the world are here in Southern Nevada this weekend for their annual symposium, and I hope some of them are listening tonight, because later we've got the story of a remote viewer who had visions of ETs living here on Earth at several places, and right after he broke that news, he died under suspicious circumstances. In fact, I think he died right here in Las Vegas. We'll be hearing that story from my second guest. Also on the website, an odd video from the surface of Mars recorded by one of the rovers up there on the red planet. Two different shots of some kind of light or orb off in the distance. It's in different positions in the different shots, so it seems to be moving. And one of the shots, it's lower than the horizon, so it's not a star. But what the heck is it? We're going to ask Lee Spiegel about that coming up, because he's been working on that story. Stimulating articles in our collection about a weird encounter with the unknown in the Four Corners area, sort of like Skinwalker country. A funny list of religions based on UFOs and ETs. Some of them are a bit out there, but, you know, to each his own. Some new scientific research about animal intelligence and experiments in time travel, and then a disturbing story about a social experiment conducted on Facebook done without your knowledge. Naps News on the Coast website. So bring in the dog, lock the door, pour a cup of Joe or other libation, and hunker down. Up next, journalist Lee Spiegel. As Heath Ledger's Joker put it, here we go. I'm George Knapp, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Lee Spiegel is a writer, reporter, and media personality who spent decades researching and presenting the world of unexplained phenomena and the paranormal to the public. He spent 7 years with ABC News. He was on for a couple of years with AOL News. And during an 8-year period of the 70s and into the 80s, Lee produced, wrote, and hosted nearly 1,500 programs about the unexplained for NBC Radio. He's also the only person to produce a presentation at the United Nations on the subject of UFOs. As I mentioned, he'll be speaking at the MUFON Symposium next month. His work right now for Huffington Post is read by millions of people, and he's always on the lookout for unusual, out-of-this-world stories. If you got any, I'm sure he'd like to hear from you right after you send them to me, probably. Lee, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you so much. I'm happy, always happy to be part of your cacophony of conversation.
Hey, it's kind of a sad story. Do you have any other info, Lee, first about Stan Friedman?
Nothing more of an update. I'll probably find out tomorrow, either by talking with his family or through his good friend Kathy Martin, who is his co-author on several books. All that we know for sure is that at some point this weekend, Stan had a heart attack at his home up in Canada, was at one facility today and is being taken to a larger hospital tomorrow for possible surgery. And certainly his activities have been curtailed, and like you said before, he's not the kind of guy who you want to say, you can't do this anymore.
No, he's like the Energizer Bunny.
Oh yeah, totally. And I got a note earlier today from your colleague George Norrie, who said also that the prayers are with Stan for a speedy recovery, and that he's been a mainstay on Coast to Coast and a dear friend since 1971. It turns out Stan Friedman was the first person who George Norrie and who I first interviewed decades ago in this whole field of UFOs by coincidence.
I'm sure he's going to be missed. There's a Roswell event coming up, I think, this weekend, and I would think Stan would be a fixture.
Well, I'm going to take a guess that this is probably the first time in decades that Stan will not be one of the main presenters there because he won't be there. And as you might know, in 3 weeks, you and he and I were supposed to be on a panel together at the upcoming MUFON Symposium, and I'm sure he won't be able to attend that either.
Oh, man.
And he will be greatly missed. And I will tell you this. Well, I spoke to Stan about a week ago, and he was so happy to finally have a chance to sit down with you when he was in Las Vegas doing his presentation. He loved spending time with you, finally.
Well, we've always agreed on stuff, but have always been gentlemen about it. I really admire the guy. Did you know Terry Hansen at all, Lee?
No, we never had any contact, but I knew of his passing, just read about it, and was very sad to read that as well.
You've been at this a long time, so I'm going to ask this because it's sort of a theme that we're going to be exploring later with Nick Redfern, but there have been some strange deaths in this field over the years, both people in government, potential whistleblowers, and a couple of UFO researchers. Have you ever had the knock at the door? You ever had somebody tell you that you've gone too far or threaten you or anything like that?
No. The only time that I ever thought that it might happen because I knew that my actions were being watched was in 1978 when I was preparing the United Nations presentation on UFOs. I knew that for several months my phone in New York had been tapped because I'd go to pick up the phone and make a call, and I wouldn't hear a dial tone, but I would hear breathing on the other end. And it got to the point where it was so funny that I would just suddenly say into the phone, look, guys, this is not going to be a call that relates to my UFO thing, so take a break, come back in about 10 minutes, continue your breathing, and maybe I'll have something else for you later on.
Who was on the other end, do you think? Who was it?
No, I never found out, but I did find out after spending almost a year putting that whole presentation together and spending a lot of time with various people in different countries and people who provided me with information and documents to give to all the member nations, that a couple of months after the whole presentation was over at the end of 1978, I got a call from attorney Peter Gersten, who was very involved back then with using the Freedom of Information Act to get previously classified documents out of the government. And he called me one day and said, I just got a new batch of documents, and there's a document in here about you. Are you interested in it? And you want me to send it to you? And I went, no, don't send it. I'm coming up to your office. He had an office up near Yankee Stadium in the Bronx, and I lived in Manhattan. I said, don't do anything with the document. I'm getting on the subway. I'm coming up there. I want you to hand it to me. And that's what happened. And he gave me the document, and I ended up making about a gazillion copies of it. Basically, in 1978, once the country of Grenada delegated me to work with them in bringing UFOs to the nations of the world, then that started a chain reaction between the United States ambassador to the mission of Grenada back to the State Department. And this was one of those documents that basically was from the mission ambassador to the head of the State Department at the time, saying, we know this thing is going on at the UN. Sir Eric Gary, the Prime Minister of Grenada, is planning a whole blitzkrieg presentation about UFOs. He's got these people presenting, scientists, astronauts, and we understand the person responsible for bringing all these people together is producer Lee Spiegel. How do you want us to handle this?
Cool. Well,
yeah, and that's all part of the original document. And this was dated, well, before the presentation. It was a couple of months before we did our thing at the UN. And so obviously there was some interest in what I was doing, but nobody ever took a threat at me or gave me a threat or a shot or anything. And I think maybe, George, it was because someone decided in Washington that no matter how some of the countries were going to vote on a resolution about sharing UFO information, I think probably the United States and the then Soviet Union decided, well, we're going to veto this anyway, so it's not going to matter, and so nobody will care. And then shortly after the presentation came and went, Eric Gary, the Prime Minister of Grenada, was overthrown in a political coup in Grenada, so he went away, which meant that the UFO resolution went away. And not all that long afterwards, and I'm sitting at home one night watching the news, and I see that we've just invaded Grenada, and I went, oh my God, this has to be my fault.
You should be ashamed of yourself.
What have I set in motion here?
Is this part of the theme of what you're going to be speaking about at MUFON at the symposium?
Well, and I'm glad you're going to be there, too, because you and I have some things in common about the media and UFOs, and we both have, I think, some really interesting points to make. And I've been hearing a lot recently, comments to my stories, emails sent to me by readers. People have the feeling that the media is somehow being controlled by higher-up powers that be, the shadow government, somewhere beyond our government, beyond top secret. And that, like, people like you and I are being watched, and that we're being told what we should and shouldn't report on, or that the companies that we work for have told us we need to be careful about the stories we research and write about. And I think it's a load of crap, because it's not the way my situation is with Huffington Post, and I'm sure it's not your situation with KLAS in Las Vegas. I'm sure that when you come up with a story idea, you probably have full carte blanche to just run with it and do a good story.
That's true. And just the qualifications are the same as for any story. Is it a good story? Is it solid information? Are the sources reliable? If so, we can go with it. Yeah.
And as long as I've known Stan Friedman, one of the first things he ever said to me when I interviewed him in 1975, he says, when it comes to stuff like UFOs, regardless of what people around you say or think or have an opinion on, the only thing you should pay attention is go where the evidence takes you. And that is so true, I think, probably in your line of work as well as mine. You can't put these blinders on and think that people are going to make you think the wrong things or speculate or become paranoia. And there is a paranoia, I think, that's spreading around among the true believers of alien visits to Earth.
Well, I also think that there is legitimate grounds for criticism of major media in covering this stuff, and in particular network coverage of it. There's, the kind of coverage that takes place. Either there's very little attention paid to the subject, or it's a dismissive kind of attention, because it does no good to anybody's career to cover this stuff, and you and I probably could speak to that. I mean, it hasn't got me fired or anything, but I think it's probably put a cap on how high I could go or other jobs I could get, and I don't know if that's true for you in print media or online media or not.
Well, so far, knock on wood, I've just started my 4th year at Huffington Post, and contrary to what people accuse me of, or that they accuse my bosses of at Huffington Post, is they think that in order for me to cover a particular story, especially if it's a hot story, maybe controversial, they think that I'm supposed to go through a whole editorial process with many editors above me and go all the way up to, as high as Arianna Huffington herself, to get permission to write about something and to see if I'm going to be told that I should water something down in order to keep it at a certain level, to not frighten people. None of that happens. And I was accused of this on a radio show a few weeks ago because of one of my most recent stories that's caused a bit of controversy about what some people are claiming was and is an underwater UFO alien base a few miles off the coast of Malibu.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I tell you what, Lee, the music is telling us we need to take a break. When we come back, we'll jump into that as well as talk about what you've learned about this video from the surface of Mars. Lee Spiegel, before the break, you made an interesting point about the freedom you have to pursue stories about paranormal, and I have similar freedom. Nobody's, it doesn't have to go to the CIA or the NSA or somebody like that for clearance. But before we leave this part of this discussion, you produced 1,500 programs on the Unexplained for NBC Radio. How many of those made it onto NBC Evening News? And I ask it in this context. We know Terry Hansen, who wrote that book, The Missing Times, had documented from public sources FOIA requests that the CIA had thousands of people, journalists, on its payroll at some point. We know from the Robertson panel that they were concerned about UFOs, and they instituted a policy where they're going to try to debunk the whole thing. CIA has had the ability to influence the ebb and flow of news, and even if you don't have like an NSA censor at the networks, they don't cover this stuff. I mean, they don't think it's credible. They don't pay it much attention. So the effect is really the same, isn't it?
It is, and an identical situation had occurred in the United Kingdom, where our mutual friend Nick Pope used to work for the British Ministry of Defense. He told me about a year ago that while he was working at the MOD, a policy was put into place called spin and dirty tricks. And what that meant was that any interesting UFO stories that might have been considered possible issues of national security were to be debunked as much as possible, and that in fact the people who reported the UFO encounters were to be ridiculed as much as possible to keep people from going public with this stuff. And when I asked Nick, why would the Ministry of Defense do that kind of a policy, he said, well, because there was a higher up decision that was made which said we can't tell the public that there are things operating in the skies above us that we're supposed to protect and that we can't touch and we can't catch them and we don't know what it is, so it's better to just try and sweep it under the rug. And I suspect that other countries have made similar decisions. I mean, George, you and I know whenever there's an interesting UFO story that's coming up that could warrant national attention, do we see it at the top of the newscast? No. Do we see it before the weather or the sports? No. It's thrown in with a little introduction between the anchors of some laughter with like a minute and a half left in the newscast. That's where they talk these things. Yeah. And that doesn't help the credibility of these stories one bit.
Yeah, it's down there with the water skiing squirrel, the voiceover of the water skiing squirrel.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how much credibility I give to that either. I think it was all photoshopped. But still, there is this ongoing stigma, and I don't think it has anything to do with the people claiming that it's because the government is telling the news media, the organizations that run the newspapers and the TV news. I don't think they're being told how to handle UFO reports. I think it's individual decisions made based on whether or not they think it's going to generate good numbers for them, whether they think it's worth it, and if there are no other stories that are more interesting than the UFO stories, because the stories generally don't pan out, so why should we report them? Let's just make them go away. And I understand that concept. I understand the attitude. My biggest complaint is not with the government. It's not with the news media. My complaint is with, are you ready for this? The visitors themselves. If there are visitors, I say, stop teasing us. Just show yourselves. What's the problem? And part of my own answer to that is, well, maybe they don't want to show themselves because, Earthlings are not really ready to know this yet. We're not a very alien-friendly planet when you think about what we do here. Who would want to mingle with us and become brothers and sisters with us? I don't think that we are ready as a species, and I'm pessimistic that that this kind of disclosure that people are hoping for, I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. I used to think it would, but now I don't.
Oh, I agree with you. I don't think there's disclosure is happening. There's not going to be any kind of major announcement. There might be leaks here or there, but I don't think it's in the interest of any president to do it. It would dominate the coverage. It would subject that president to ridicule. He wouldn't be able to get anything else done. And in addition, disclose what? What is it exactly? Yeah. I mean, a lot of this stuff is already out, whether people want to believe it or not. And then the stuff that might be classified, there might be a good reason for it to be classified. I go back and forth with it. I believe in the right to know. The Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, that's my religion. But there might be something in there that really would disturb a society and shake our social institutions to the foundation.
I think you're completely right. We cannot assume that we know who's making the decisions about this stuff and why. I don't have a need to know. I don't think you have a need to know, and I'm okay with that. But I'm more concerned with people who are being deliberately ridiculed. I think that kind of stuff has to stop if it's at all possible.
Let's talk about this underwater base story. I saw those images when they first came out. I'm sure a lot of our listeners saw it as well. It popped up on. Did it pop up on Huffington Post first? Or I know
no.
I saw it online first.
No, I first heard about it several weeks ago. I got a call from another radio host. I won't even give his name out on the air or the name of his show, but he got in touch with me and said, Lee, a couple of these images from Google Earth came to our attention. We think this might be really significant. Are you interested in maybe putting a story together? And I looked at these images and I thought, well, yeah. And here's another example, George, of how I didn't have to go anywhere to get permission to write this story at Huffington Post. I made the decision on my own. This was interesting. I don't know exactly what the pictures show, but I went to my editor and said, I want to do this story. Okay? And he said, yeah, interesting pictures. Go do it. And that was it. That was the extent of who I had to get permission from to do the story, because they trust that I'm going to do something that's going to have, I hope, some kind of journalistic integrity, the same way your folks trust you with what you put on the air as well. So I'm looking at these pictures, and they are interesting, and we have to remember that Google Earth pictures, especially of underwater things, aren't totally actual pictures. They're representations of initial data that comes in from different sources that they use, from different satellites and other mechanisms that they try and map out the topography of things going on underwater. So the best that the illustrations can show is this thing looks like, for all intents and purposes, from above, it looks like a sports arena with a dome on top, about 3 miles wide from one end of the dome to the other. It's sitting on against some bedrock 6 miles out from the coast of Malibu, and from the front of it, it appears to be held up by a series of columns or pillars, and underneath and going through these columns or pillars is some vague darkness. And so it hit the internet, and people are now wondering and speculating, well, this could be the comings and goings of all these UFOs or USOs, the unidentified submerged objects that people keep claiming to see going into and out of the water off the coast of California. Where are they going to? Well, they must be going into this underwater base. We should send a submersible down there, like what James Cameron used when he went down to the Titanic. Good idea. I say, do it. Raise some money. Go down there and see what this is. But I put the story together, George, and I put a whole slideshow together, about 12 images of this thing, and I did not take the point of view that I thought this was evidence of an underwater alien base, because there's nothing there that's evidential of that. But the people who turned me on to it kept saying to me, well, we think that we've discovered this thing and that it is possible evidence of it. Well, in the course of putting my story together, I spoke to a geologist, an Egyptologist, and my friend Ben Hansen, a former FBI special agent who's been trained to analyze videos and images. And all three of these guys said to me, there's every evidence that this is a natural geological formation as part of the vast earthquake fault line area of Southern California. And there's nothing else that indicates it's anything more than that. Well, I put the story together, and the host of this radio show out in California had said to me, as soon as your story is done, let me know, and we'll put you on the radio, and we'll talk about it. So the day that I sent him my story, he sent me an email back, and he said, thanks, Lee, for the story. We're going to talk about it on the show tonight. But he didn't actually invite me on the show. I was uninvited to be on that show, George. And so I tuned into the show on my computer that night to listen to them talking for 2 hours, bashing me and raising questions about why did I write the story that was so lopsided? How could I not think that it wasn't an underwater UFO alien base? And how could the Huffington Post have decided that Lee Spiegel should take this attitude about it? And I'm sitting here listening to this going, wait a minute, that's not how this happened. Follow the evidence where it leads, please. And
that's
the evidence.
It was a mistake on multiple levels on the part of that show because, hey, if they're going to bash you, it's a much better show to do it on the air with you there.
I know, and the geologist who I interviewed, he and the Egyptologist, their names were given to me by the host of the radio show, who said, "Hey Lee, you should call these guys. They'll give you really good opinions." Well, they did, and their opinions were, it's geology, it's not UFOs. And the geologist sent me an official paper from the Geological Survey organization from like 5 years ago, in which they showed in a PDF official document an illustration of this object on the bottom of the ocean. They even gave it a name. They call it the Sycamore Knoll, with complete explanations of why this is geological in nature. So these people on the radio show, they did not discover this. It had already been researched by the real people. So I can't take the attitude that, well, this might be an alien base. That's not what I do. I'm following the evidence, and if people don't like that, I'm sorry about that.
I know. People have really strong opinions about these topics, and they assume that you should, if you buy one part of it, you should buy all of it. And, of course, you can't, because some of it is just flat out crazy. I mean, it is. Let's talk about...
Well, go ahead.
I was going to ask you about this video. We only got a couple of minutes left, so I want to ask you about this video from the surface of Mars. You had sent it to me the other day. I don't know if you've written your piece on it yet. What are you finding?
Yeah. Well, I'm holding it for tomorrow because I'm waiting and expecting tomorrow to talk to an image scientist out at the JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who can give me some information about this. Basically, earlier this past week, the JPL released, and you can even go on their site, they actually have a page. It's called Raw Images from the Mars Curiosity rover. The information I first was told was that the pictures were taken by the Mars Opportunity rover. Well, even that was not correct. It's like media has got to get it right. It was the Curiosity rover that took a couple of pictures, snapped two pictures that appeared to show in the distance, near some mountains, a bright light. And because the camera took two different angles of it, the second picture made it appear to look as though the light moved because of the angle of the camera. Well, I'm fully expecting that a scientist is going to say to me that this has something to do with either an aberration of a pixel on the camera, or the sun maybe shining off of something on the mountain. And the reason I say that, George, is because 2 months ago, the same rover, the Curiosity, took two pictures of another bright light, an even brighter light, that was actually on the ground on Mars.
Oh, yeah, and I remember that. Yep.
One camera, the right camera, took one picture, and the left camera took another picture, but the right picture showed the light, but the left picture didn't, and they kept going back and forth, so you could see that there was obviously some difference in the camera and not the thing on the ground. They thought it ended up being maybe a shiny rock that for a moment was glinting off the sun, and that was a good explanation. So, I just caution people, don't believe everything you see without checking it out, doing your own legwork. Don't just go to websites and pay attention and think, oh, this is great. It must be, it must be aliens from Mars, and, why aren't we being told about this?
Yeah, I think what was intriguing to me about the second shot is that, it had one object up and above the horizon, and the other shot was below the horizon as if it had moved. Yeah. So an object below the horizon, you would think that's not a star or another planet or something like that.
Right. But if the camera had moved just a little bit, then it would appear to be below, below the tops of the mountains. So I just want someone tomorrow at JPL to say to me, here's what we think it is. Again, George, if they wanted to hide this kind of stuff, they wouldn't have made it public on their actual JPL website.
Do you think they do that? Do you think they hide stuff?
That's right. Stick the knife in and then twist it. See what I'll say.
Maybe you can answer that question after you get your phone call from them tomorrow. Government.
Ask me the question again when I see you in 3 weeks.
All right. Well, let's say in general, if not specific to JPL, but you think that government images, documents, reports are cleansed of stuff that regarding UFOs they don't want us to see.
Well, since you've asked me point blank, I am going to say, and I never give this attitude out of my stories. I like to stay neutral. But yeah, I think because of the large numbers of people who have come forward over the years, who've worked for the government in different facilities, who seem to be very credible, and don't mind, they're retired, so it's not going to be like they're going to have their careers killed or anything, or themselves killed. I think that there's enough anecdotal evidence from people who were in the know that says that some stuff has been kept from the public. We know just from the huge amounts of previously classified documents that our government has been involved with many encounters with UFOs on many occasions where these things outperformed any of our aircraft in doing maneuvers and things that we couldn't possibly have the same kind of equipment or aircraft to compete with them. So there's too much anecdotal information. Airline pilots won't publicly talk about things that they've seen that have come close to their aircraft because they know it would be a career killer if they ever went public with these things. And yet we know that there are many pilots who have seen these things and had encounters and who will only talk to former NASA scientist Dr. Richard Haynes, who has his own organization called NARCAP. It's only for pilots who will report to him in complete confidence about what they've seen. Those are the kind of reports I'm really interested in.
I'd like to hear you talk about, we're out of time, though, is about the Vatican. If there was ever going to be disclosure by a world leader, I think this Pope might be the guy. I mean, he's really making waves, and the Vatican has shown it is certainly open to discussing ET matters and UFOs and things of that sort, and that it would not necessarily represent a threat to the Church. I wouldn't be surprised if this guy might be the one to say something. And in 30 seconds, can you agree or disagree? Or
I totally agree. About a month ago, at one of his morning masses, Pope Francis said in front of the throngs of people in the Vatican that if Martians were to visit us and asked to be baptized, who are we to say no? And that went around the world. And also, my friend, maybe you know, the Ted Peters, Lutheran minister.
Sure.
He spent 15 years in Italy spending time with Vatican astronomers. Most people don't know that the Vatican has their own observatories. What are they looking for in outer space, I wonder?
Yeah. Hey, Lee Spiegel, it's great talking to you. I look forward to seeing your presentation at the MUFON Symposium in July, and look forward to chatting with you off the record and off the air as well. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, George.
I'll talk to you again soon. Coming up, Dick Redfern and his new book, Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind. Much more to come here on Coast to Coast AM. Nick Redfern is a ufologist and cryptozoologist, author of many books on UFOs, cryptozoology, the paranormal, and conspiracy theories. I think I read somewhere he's written 20 books. He writes regularly for UFO Magazine, Fate Magazine, and others, and has helped to uncover thousands of pages of previously classified classified documents from the Royal Air Force, the Air Ministry, and Ministry of Defense, files on UFOs and other topics. And it's always good to have him on the program. Nick, good to have you back.
Hey, George. Thanks for having me on again.
Great book. I very much enjoyed it in a spooky, scary kind of a way. I want to start this way. I shared with you some emails of your fellow ufologists who said, oh, gosh, here comes Nick with a scary story, and he's doing nobody any good by making us think that aliens are evil or the government is evil. Let's just get that out of the way. What do you say to those guys?
Well, I mean, when it comes to the whole issue of ufology, the fact is that there have been some unusual deaths in the subject, and there's no point, as I see it, in trying to, deny those cases exist or that the deaths didn't occur. They clearly did, and for that reason, they need addressing. I think that if people just want to see the positive side of the phenomenon, well, they're just, they're sort of looking at it from one perspective. Instead of looking at it from every perspective. And I don't believe in ignoring data because it's unsettling or it doesn't fit into one particular belief system. And when you look into this angle of unusual deaths in relation to the UFO field, it's a real phenomenon, and I just don't understand the concept of ignoring that.
I'm with you on that. I mentioned in the beginning of the program, I don't think you were able to hear it, but in the beginning of the program I said, we've been having these alien editorials for 50 years. The first contactees who were told, hey, you humans need to take care of your planet, stop blowing up nuclear weapons, control pollution, or else something bad's going to happen, as if they really care about us. I think the most you can say about these visitors or others or whatever they are is that they would be agnostic about humans, that I guess they have the technology to blow us all up or wipe us off the face of the earth if they wanted to, but you look at the overall consequences, they haven't destroyed us, but they haven't done us any favors either.
No, you're right, and I think the phenomenon is often viewed by people as from a very simplistic perspective. The aliens are good, they're here to help us. Well, the human race isn't necessarily good or bad. We all have the capability to be good and to be bad. Most people use common sense and realize where the line should not be crossed, and if there are intelligent entities out there, then I don't see why they should be any different. And I think it's a little bit naive to take a stance that everything is just all love and light and, positive. It clearly isn't. And, I have a problem when people deny the darker side of the subject because it does exist. It's a shame that it does. It'd be better if it didn't, but it does. So.
I guess if you buy the idea, and some people don't, if you buy the idea that there is some sort of visitation or at least interaction with some other kind of intelligence, that it may be multiple intelligences, and therefore it could be multiple agendas. It's not just one agenda, it could be several.
Yeah, and I think this sort of demonstrates how little we really know about the intelligences behind the phenomenon. Clearly there's a genuine UFO phenomenon. Clearly people see UFOs and have had interaction with the entities behind them. But we have to ask the question, when these events occur, abductions and things like this, and we're told it's for our own good and it's going to help the future. My view has always been, why do so many people take those stories at face value? Why should it be the case that we're being told the truth? Maybe there is an even deeper, darker side that we don't know about, and we're being deceived, just totally across the board. But again, people don't want to hear that, unfortunately.
I'm with you. I view it as sort of alien advertising. It's like a pitchman saying, buy these tires, they'll save your life someday. Not necessarily the best tires for you to buy, or not necessarily good tires at all.
Exactly.
Tell me this, how did you get the idea for this book? I mean, you cast a wide net and include a lot of stories, some stories that I had heard before, some that I have never heard even an inkling about. I mean, did you watch the movie E.T. Once too often and figure you needed to balance things out?
Actually, that's a good point, but no. I guess there's sort of two things, really. One is, whenever I'm writing a new book, and if people are going to buy it, you want to be able to give them something new. So I always look for a new angle to write about, and over the years, I think most people have heard about the occasional unusual death within the UFO field. But I realize that nobody had ever sort of tackled the subject from the 40s to the present day in the form of a full-length book specifically on that topic. So I spent about 18 months digging into all some of the well-known cases, but as you point out as well, a lot of cases that people just simply would not have been aware of, and then looked at them all chronologically, saw where the evidence lay and the theories and so on, and then decided, this would be a good book for people who are interested in not just so much the darker side of ufology, but how and why and the many and varied reasons as to why people have met mysterious ends in the UFO field. And I would hope, people sort of perceive it as a valuable contribution to this aspect of the phenomenon.
Oh, I'd say it definitely is that and more. You jump right into the deep end of the pool right at the beginning of this book. There's a part of the chapter is dubbed The Melting Man, and you tell this story about something that happened in 1946 in a Brazilian village. You must get this question a lot. I get the question a lot as well, in association with cattle mutilations. Animals are carved up. Some people think it's aliens that are doing it, or humans and aliens. And have there ever been any kind of cases where humans get carved up or slashed up or burned? And you start right off the bat with a pretty dramatic case. Tell us about it.
Well, yeah, sure. This one actually dates 1 year before the modern era of ufology began in 47. This was March 1946, and involved a Brazilian farmer named Prestes Filho, who lived in a little village in one particular part of Brazil, and walking home late one night to the little village, and everything seemed normal at first. But he had this sort of sense that we all get from now and again of being watched. That sort of sense that somebody's sort of looking over your shoulder, and suddenly you turn around and sure enough they are. He had that kind of feeling, couldn't shake it off. Well, he finally got back home. It was late at night. He'd been out fishing all day. Went to his home, still had this strange feeling, and felt compelled to look outside the window of his home. As he did so, he was suddenly bathed in a bright light which emanated from some sort of bright object that was stationary in the sky. And he suddenly felt very, very hot, almost as if he was starting to cook. And according to the story, that's exactly what happened, that it wasn't as if he'd just been sort of affected by, a sunburn or something like that. He got hotter and hotter and fell sick, and eventually friends in the village came around, quickly raced over to see him to hear what all the screaming was about, and said that his skin was literally starting to peel off his body. Now, it didn't stop there. It was almost as if, with hindsight, he'd been affected by something like a microwave. If you cook food in a microwave, the reason why they tell you to let it stand afterwards is because the food is actually still cooking. The microwaves are still cooking. And that seems to be a similar analogy to what happened to Filho, is that his body continued to cook and literally melt. And there was what was essentially like a race to the local hospital to try and save him. And by the time they got him to the hospital, his skin was literally falling off in chunks, and he supposedly melted right before the eyes of the doctors. Now, it sounds a controversial story, except for the fact that a number of the people who were involved are still alive today and have gone on record as talking about this case and their recollections of seeing him and the man's body just unfortunately melting away. Now, of course, that doesn't happen under any normal circumstances, and it's significant that it was tied in with the sighting of this strange light in the sky that specifically and directly beamed this light down at Filho. So the only way I can kind of rationalize this is that it was an outright hostile act. There doesn't seem to be any other reason for it.
Nick, I've seen some photos over the years of what purports to be I don't know if it's the same case. I think it is from Brazil, of a guy who was really burned, severely burned, and cut up or carved up. Do you know what photos I'm talking about? And is that the same thing? Have you seen photos associated with this case?
I haven't seen photos associated with this one, but there are a few different pictures from various parts of South America. South America actually has a lot of very violent UFO reports over the years. Jacques Vallée collected a lot of reports from Brazil, and many of those have a hostile aspect to them. But I have an entire chapter in the book on human mutilations that kind of parallel the cattle mutilation phenomenon, and thankfully, at least the number of reports that we know of aren't that many, but even, one, you could argue, is one too many. And I think when you talk about human mutilations, then you're really getting into, the very dark side of the phenomenon.
Well, we are going to talk about it a little bit later. Before we leave this case, we should point out, this was 1946 in the middle of the jungle out in Brazil, and it's not like the U.S. had planes or helicopters flying around armed with microwave weapons at that time.
No, that's right. There's several important factors about this. One, the object was hovering, and yes, there were helicopters at the time, but they weren't anywhere near as widespread as today. On top of that, it was just a little remote village. Third thing, the object, whatever it was totally silent. And then, of course, there was this sort of powerful beam weapon, or however you want to describe it. And clearly, nobody from here, at least, was flying something that possessed that technology, almost 70 years ago. So I think we can sort of state with a fair degree of, accuracy that this was a genuine UFO incident.
The other case you jump into early in the book is Maury Island, and I'll tell you, it's something that I've just sort of glossed over the years. I know it's important, but it's so hard to follow these characters. It's confusing, but you do a really good job of sort of boiling it down to its essence, and it's important because it's right there at the birth of the modern UFO era. Tell us about that story.
Well, this actually occurred just a couple of days before Kenneth Arnold's famous encounter on June 24, 1947, at a place called Maury Island, which is in Tacoma in Washington State. And the story involved a man named Harold Dahl, who worked the local harbour, sort of picking up wreckage and bits of, debris, etc., so that, it wouldn't interfere with the passage of the boats that travelled the area. And he and his crew were out on their boat in the harbour one particular day when they saw what essentially you could describe as like a squadron of flying saucers. They were kind of donut-shaped with hollowed-out centres. One of these objects seemed to be malfunctioning in the sense it was wobbling in the sky and then reportedly exploded, showering down this strange wreckage into the harbour, which was essentially two different types of wreckage. One was like a very light foil, and the other was more like a slag-type material. And Harold Dahl and his crew looked on in amazement as this occurred. The other object shot away at high speed, and they returned to the shore, by which time some of this wreckage was starting to wash up on the shore. So they collected it all up, and Dahl handed some of it over to his superior within the shipwork, a man named Fred Chrisman, who, interestingly enough, turned up in the Kennedy assassination years later. Well, Chrisman contacted local media, and it wasn't long before the military got hold of the story as well, which not surprising because they were talking, the press were talking about strange wreckage from a UFO. And what happened was that two military officers from Army Intelligence, a First Lieutenant Frank Mercer Brown and a Captain William Lee Davidson of Army Intelligence, they flew out to Maury Island. The intention was they would pick some of this wreckage up and take it to what at the time was called Wright Field, today called Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, which has a long history of involvement in the UFO subject. Well, what happened was that Mercer Brown and Davidson took to the skies from Maury Island with this wreckage. Actually didn't get far at all, unfortunately, because their aircraft a Boeing B-29 actually burst into flames not long after takeoff, crashed to the ground, and both men were killed. Now, interestingly and suspiciously, the wreckage that they returned with was never found. Whether or not somebody else got to the crash site first, we don't know. But that was only the beginning of the deaths. Two of the local media guys who also reported on the incident, they died under unusual circumstances, and to the point where the people doing the autopsy couldn't really figure out what it was that had killed them. And even Kenneth Arnold, responsible for essentially kicking the UFO subject off in the summer of '47, was actually hired by Ray Palmer, the editor of Amazing Stories magazine, to go out to Maury Island to investigate the case, which he did. And when Arnold had completed his investigation and was returning home, he took to the skies in his aircraft and almost was killed himself. It was only through his skill as a pilot that Arnold managed to land his plane, and it turned out that whoever had refueled the plane prior to Arnold's takeoff had failed to shut the fuel valve. And so what happened was that when the aircraft took to the skies, the fuel actually froze in the tank, and Arnold was very lucky not to be killed. So we had 4 deaths in one case, 2 military people, 2 media people, almost the death of the man who single-handedly ushered in the modern era of ufology, and all revolving around this strange wreckage found in Maury Island.
I was thinking to myself, I had never read the part about Kenneth Arnold almost dying, and I guess it's just his sheer skill as a pilot that kept him alive. But the idea that whoever refueled the aircraft left the fuel valve open, yeah, that could happen. But when you have it on back-to-back deaths, it seems less like a coincidence.
Yeah, if it was just Arnold's plane, you could say it was just some terrible accident, somebody just made a major mistake. But when we've got, all within a matter of days, Mercer Brown and Davidson from Army Intelligence dead, the wreckage gone, the 2 guys from the media, one of them a man named Ted Morello, who actually warned Arnold to get out of town because there were strange things going down. So, very, very weird situation that's just a massive catalogue of deaths, if you like.
We're talking with Nick Redfern about close encounters of the fatal kind. When we come back, Roswell, the granddaddy of UFO stories, had some deaths and some death threats, and we're going to get into that in a moment. Welcome back to Coast to Coast. 25 years ago this summer, I made my first visit to Roswell, New Mexico, following in the paths of a lot of researchers who had been down there checking stuff out about the Roswell mystery. And one of the guys I interviewed had never done a TV interview before. His name is Glenn Dennis, and he was the mortician in Roswell in 1947 during the time when the craft, whatever it was, crashed. And he told me a really interesting story about confirming a sort of a rumor that had been around about the Army requesting these tiny little caskets, child-sized caskets. Well, it turns out that that story is, of course, Glenn Dennis is now well known in the Roswell field, and his story has made the rounds, but there's some angles to it that Nick Redfern explores in his new book that I had not heard before. Nick, tell us recap for us the story about Glenn Dennis and how that leads into the story you tell about this nurse, the mystery nurse.
Yeah, sure. Well, Glenn Dennis, as you point out, surfaced with his story in the late 1980s, how when he was a mortician in Roswell in 1947, that he was contacted by the military who wanted to know if he had any small caskets, and asked sort of all sorts of questions about the preservation of bodies and so forth. And it was clear to Dennis that something strange was going on out at the base. And so he traveled out there, puzzled by the questions and so forth, and met with someone who initially he described as a nurse friend at the base, who was in a state of essentially like a combination of shock and fear. and she said that these strange little bodies had been brought in, and she'd seen them, and they were sort of terrible and creepy to see. And as I say, she was almost in like a state of shock. And Dennis actually didn't talk about this publicly until sort of 1989, 1990, when his story first really began to come out. Now, by Dennis's own admission, he never revealed the real name of the nurse. And so this made it problematic for people to try and find her. And various people have been put forward over the years, but as I point out in the book, the most likely candidate was a woman named Miriam Bush. She actually wasn't a nurse at the base, but she was an executive secretary who worked under the chief medical officer at the base, a man named Lieutenant Colonel Harold Warren. Now, Miriam Bush, why her story is so significant is that her family has gone on record as stating that she told her family of the events at Roswell back in 1947. In other words, she didn't wait like Glendennis 30, 40, 50 years. She actually told her family at the time, and it became like one of these sort of classic dark family secrets that nobody wants to talk about. But when the story surfaced and Roswell became sort of, known across pretty much the entire world, then her family decided to go public and said, yes, the family was told about this by Miriam years ago. Now, what's particularly disturbing is that, as you rightly point out, in 1989, Dennis began to tell his story. Well, it was actually later in 1989 that Miriam Bush, who by that time was living essentially in fear, paranoia, and descended into complete alcoholism, she was found dead in a hotel room. Now, what was very weird is that, number one, she'd actually signed into the hotel room using her sister's name and address, and although it was said to have been suicide, when she was found, she actually had like a polythene plastic bag over her head, over her head, and bruises on her arms. Now, you can look at it from the angle that, yes, she just committed suicide. Certainly her family said she was frightened and she was worried that she was being watched and followed. And the big question, of course, is, well, why should that have been the case? And if we look at the time frame, this was actually just months after Glendennis told his story.
Actually, it might be closer than that, Nick, because we interviewed him in July. He told me it was his first interview ever, but we didn't air it until November, the first week in November.
Well, that's interesting, because it was right at the end of 1989 that Miriam Bush was found dead. Now, when we sort of address this particular issue, I think what's important is that Miriam Bush in 1989 could well have been one of the very few last surviving people who actually saw the bodies and could talk about them from seeing them up close and personal, so to speak, and could have really added to the story, and who had a highly credible background. Most of the people who were at Roswell either died earlier and told family members, or they were responsible for picking up pieces of wreckage. But Miriam Bush was someone who was really in the thick of things. So, it's kind of highly disturbing that just after Glendennis went public, that she became very fearful she was being watched, and then suddenly turned up dead. It sounds like something straight out of the X-Files, until we realised that, it's all too true. Miriam Bush really did end her days dead in a hotel room with a plastic bag over her head.
And only a few weeks after Glendennis revealed to the public, or his story was made public, that such a nurse existed. That's spooky stuff. It almost as spooky as the other stuff you have about Roswell, and this really is right out of the X-Files. You talk about the spread of these strange viruses in that area at the same time, and you would think, well, that sounds like something somebody would make up, some UFO researcher's fantasy, except that you came up with some documents from the FBI that discuss this, that coincide, and it raises the hair on your arms.
Yeah, well, this relates to a controversial story that first surfaced in the mid-1990s from a California researcher named Timothy Cooper, who's now out of the UFO subject. But Cooper claimed to have various old-timer contacts in the military who'd shared information and data with him, some of which related to an alleged outbreak of a very strange virus excuse me, at the crash site of the Roswell event, and possibly other crashed UFO events in New Mexico in the same time frame. And according to the information given to Cooper, a number of the technicians and retrieval people involved in the event suddenly felt very quickly fell sick, fell ill, began bleeding from the mouth and the nose, and fell victim to some sort of virus that affected them, not unlike something like Ebola. Just took them very, very quickly, and essentially, as I said, they were just sort of bleeding from every orifice, so to speak. And the story, of course, as I said, was one told to Cooper essentially off the record by a number of these retired elderly people he'd been speaking to. Now, that story had always fascinated me, and so I began looking into it, really to see what else was going on in Lincoln County, New Mexico, which is where the crash happened in the summer of 1947. Most people had focused on the event itself. I decided to focus on what else was going on there. One of the things that amazed me was that there actually was a catalogue of deaths within Lincoln County in that exact same time period, in which people had died from various types of plague and viruses. And what surprised me even more was that when I used the Freedom of Information Act, which is something I often do to secure the release of documents, I actually got hold of like a 700-page file, that much of which was actually focused upon a catalogue, a series of weird deaths from plague and various other viruses, right in the heart of Lincoln County in the summer of 1947. Now, what makes the story even more intriguing is that, according to a number of the people who were involved in the Roswell event, some of the wreckage was taken to a military base in New Mexico called the Sandia Base. Now, what's interesting is that these same files, which are official files, as I said, which have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act, they actually talk about how there was also an outbreak of this virus, this plague, at the Sandia Base in the same time frame. So we have Lincoln County and we have the Sandia Base, both tied to the Roswell event in the summer of 47, and also in the summer of 47 we have an outbreak of this weird plague in Lincoln County and at the Sandia Base. And the official records demonstrate that there was a major concern that the Sandia outbreak was actually deliberate, that it wasn't just due to a bite from an infected rat or something like that.
Yeah, the title of the document. The title of your document that you got, right?
Yes, and so this is sort of a little-known aspect of the subject, which to a significant degree corroborates these off-the-record stories given to people like Tim Cooper years earlier of strange viruses and unusual deaths. And a number of the people who died, they were actually taken to a military hospital called Fort Stanton in New Mexico. And the documents talk about how it was everything from young children to adults, and they died very, very quickly, and it was perceived as being at least some form of plague. And the documents are fascinating when you sort of look at it from the perspective of what was going on in the UFO field at the time, and the stories about the crash and the stories given to Tim Cooper. And, I have to say that it actually sort of dovetails very, very closely.
The title of the document that you got out of the FBI through FOIA, so this is not something that was mailed by anonymous sources, this is right from the FBI, is Bacteriological Warfare in the United States. I mean, that title suggests to me that somebody in the FBI thought it was bacterial warfare of some sort.
Yeah, there were major concerns that this wasn't just, as I said, an outbreak of plague from flea bites or rat bites, that kind of thing, that it was something else entirely, to the extent that all of the files that related to these deaths in Lincoln County, all the documents on them were actually shared with the director of the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, the director of the CIA, and the acting director of the Atomic Energy Commission. Now, when you realise that factor as well, that these strange deaths, these controversial deaths of young children and adults in Lincoln County, all the records, the autopsy files, the studies, were all being sent to the highest levels of the intelligence community, the CIA, Air Force Office of Special Investigations, the Atomic Energy Commission. They were all getting the documents on these unusual Lincoln County deaths. So, and it all comes back to the summer of 47, right where the events occurred. And to me, at least, this is one of the most sort of significant developments in the Roswell story, in the sense it doesn't, ironically, directly relate to documents on the crash, but when you look at what he does do, is sort of vindicate what else was going on around in Lincoln County at the time, which we can apply to the crash itself. And I think that's an important thing to do when we're looking into UFO cases, is not just to look into the event, see what else was going on around town and around the area at the time. And it was through that process that I was able to get hold of this file, which as you point out, is a FOIA document. It's not questionable or anything like that at all.
Well, this is what jumps out at me also about that file, and I think it is dramatic and significant, is that you got a file of 709 pages, but that was from a document of 1,783 pages, meaning more than 1,000 pages are still classified for reasons of national security. Right?
Yeah, that's correct. This file actually dates back to from about early 1940s to about 1950. So pretty much 60, 70 years old. And you're quite right, George, that substantial amounts of the documents, certainly more than 50%, are still withheld for national security reasons. And the FOIA does allow, obviously, documents to surface into the public domain, but there are certain rules and regulations that allow for the continuation of withholding of documents, and without doubt that this is one of them, and we can only kind of speculate as to what might be contained in the additional material. And I find that intriguing, that such an old file should still be classified.
Yeah. You also note that this one boy who died of this mysterious plague had apparently contracted it at a very unique spot.
Well, yeah, I mean, this sort of comes back to, the whole issue of what was going on and who was doing what and where and so on. But the boy in question, I mean, this is one of the more interesting ones. He died sort of very, very quickly, and he was taken to this place, as I said, called Fort Stanton, and actually died at the hospital there, right in Lincoln County, and he fell ill and was actually sent home initially, but then just got worse and worse, and literally died. He was just like 7.5 years old. But this was right in the heart of Lincoln County, and where he actually lived was literally like about 3 miles from the crash site on the Foster Ranch, where the rancher Brazel found all the wreckage.
I should point out that for people that don't know your other books, is that you're not a guy who drank the Roswell Kool-Aid. You don't necessarily buy hook, line, and sinker the generic story that's told by the UFO community. You have questioned it and presented other scenarios, so it's not like you're singing to the choir here.
No, I mean, I've always been of the opinion that when we look at the UFO subject, from any perspective of the subject, but we should look at all angles, because I always tell people that the U in UFO still stands for unidentified, and that's why I feel we should touch all bases, and that's also why I feel it's important to share these documents and this story of unusual deaths right in the same time frame and place as the Roswell affair, because if it were just being kept sort of in-house with the local hospital or something, that's one thing. But to see that all the records on these deaths were, as I said, shared with the CIA, Air Force Intelligence, Atomic Energy Commission, this is sort of a major discovery of major revelation and major implications that, I think more digging into this could possibly open up further angles as to possibly why Roswell was kept secret. If there was some sort of sinister viral aspect to the case, then that might arguably be even more of a reason to hide the truth than just the idea that a UFO crashed.
One other, we got to take a break in about 2 minutes. One other of the important historical cases that you touch on and sort of explore in a much broader context is Captain Mantell. Everybody who's read about UFOs knows the case of Thomas Mantell, who died while chasing a UFO. And folks have done a really good job of trying to dismiss that. He was confused. He didn't really see it. He ran out of fuel and he died. What's your take on that case?
Well, my take on the Mantell affair, which occurred in March 1948, when he was essentially vectored onto a UFO to try and figure out what it was. All we know for sure is that Mantell pursued or headed towards this object, and the next thing happened after he said that he could see this object, that it was bright and huge, was that his plane plummeted to the ground and he was killed. Now, the important thing is that clearly there was something in the sky, and various theories have been put forward that it was a large balloon called a skyhook balloon. Another theory is that it was the planet Venus. To me, these don't hold water. The reason being that when you listen to theories like that, it kind of implies that Mantell was almost, an inexperienced person who just wasn't used to seeing balloons and couldn't tell Venus from, a flying saucer or whatever. And that kind of really does discredit to Mantell himself, because he was actually a very decorated pilot who served in the Second World War. And, he had countless hours flying. He wasn't like somebody who was green and new to the subject of flying and just signed up. No, he was somebody who had a long, sort of prestigious career and, decorated in the Second World War. And so he was no fool. So he clearly saw something, and the fact that the official story was changed a couple of times, has got to give rise to suspicion that they actually saw something strange, and there was sort of like a scramble to try and figure out what it was, but from a down-to-earth perspective.
Captain Edward Ruppelt, head of Blue Book, in your book, you say he investigated, and he said, to use a trite term, it was a masterpiece in the art of weasel wording. We'll finish up talking about the Mantell incident and move on to other dramatic cases of where planes were vanished and crashed and people died under mysterious circumstances while trying to tell the truth about UFO encounters and UFO documents. Some years ago, Nick, I had the pleasure of interviewing a guy named Howard Cannon, who served with Captain Thomas Mantell. He was there when the Mantell died, and he told me years later, before Howard Cannon died, that it was an insult to he and other pilots that Mantell wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Howard Cannon went on to become a U.S. Senator, served 4 terms. He was instrumental in building Nellis Air Force Base and Area 51, and was very interested in the UFO topic as well. So I got a feeling that there's a lot of people who would have served with Mantell who felt the same way. You spoke to a whistleblower, a British Royal Air Force person, who told you sort of much the same thing on a broader scale about other incidents involving crashes, right?
Yeah, this is a woman named Rita Hill, and Rita was a sergeant with the British Royal Air Force in the 1940s. She worked at a place in the south of England called Boscombe Down. Boscombe Down still exists today, and it's where the British military tests a lot of its new and sort of radical and unusual aircraft. Certainly, it's not as remote as Area 51 or anything like that, but it is where, as I said, the British military test flies sort of new and exotic hardware. And she told me that as far back as the late 1940s, which is when she was stationed there, that when some of these new and experimental aircraft were being flown, the pilots would report suddenly being buzzed by UFOs. And they're often described as disc-shaped objects or just sort of bright lights in the sky. But what's most disturbing of all is that Rita told me how on many occasions when these objects would appear, the instrument panels, the process of flying the aircraft just became impossible. The altimeters and so forth would just stop. The mechanics of the aircraft wouldn't respond properly, and there were actually a number of crashes. And she told me that there was actually one point in the late 1940s where they had on average a crash a week in relation to these UFO encounters, and that everybody was told, you won't talk about this, and it went up the chain of command, and everybody was reminded they'd signed the British government's Official Secrets Act, which covered things like that back then. And the important thing was that, Rita gave me a huge amount of information on her regular work, photographs of her time spent there. She clearly, was who she claimed to be. And when I interviewed her, which was late 90s, she still remembered it very, very clearly and told me how it was such a, not only was it disturbing, but it was a big tragedy as well, because they actually knew many of the pilots who were killed. They were just young guys testing aircraft and suddenly found themselves plunged into a UFO situation.
The last time I had a chance to interview Tim Good, who was a colleague of ours, has written some really important books about UFOs. He described sort of an unofficial, undeclared war that went on I think in the 1950s and maybe into the 60s, where there were a lot of planes all over the world that went down while chasing UFOs that were unacknowledged. I don't know, you don't touch on that in this book, but do you think that did you find anything that would sort of support that view?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is, for example, there's the Mantell case. I talk about another one, well, actually two mysterious aircraft crashes / disappearances in Wisconsin in '53, and there are other cases as well. And I think there's a good argument can be made that certainly in that era, we did lose a lot of aircraft. And I think the idea of sort of an undeclared war is an interesting one, because as far as I can tell, it seems that what happened was that, the Point K, where there were so many disappearances of aircraft and crashes and so on, that somebody just gave the order, if you like, or even an unofficial order, don't engage them any longer. It's clearly not working.
Well, I know that happened in Russia. I know for sure it happened in Russia, because the guy who gave me the order told me that on camera, so I'm sure it probably happened here too.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me, the idea that, I mean, after a while, it's like the penny drops, and we clearly don't have the upper hand, or didn't have the upper hand then, and so I think it was more along the lines of just back off, monitor them, but don't try and engage them, because you're just going to come off worse,
One other point about the Mantell case, and then we'll move on, is that you made this note at the end of that chapter, and I had never read this before, about the condition of his body. Do you remember what you wrote?
Yeah, sure. This actually came from the deputy commander at Godman Field, which is where Mantell was based. He was actually part of Fort Knox. And the deputy commander at the time was a Captain James Duesler. And Duesler went on the record in the 1990s as talking not just about the case, but the condition of Mantell's body. And this was very, very strange. The fact that the aircraft that he was flying, fell from the skies literally thousands of feet. And when they recovered his body, although his bones were reportedly shattered, as not surprisingly, there wasn't a single scratch on his body. There weren't any lacerations, no cuts, absolutely nothing at all. Now, anyone who knows anything about aircraft crashes will tell you that it can be a grisly sight when something like an airliner goes down at high speed. But for Mantell, as I said, that he had no scratches, no blood, nothing. It was just sort of internally, his body was massively disrupted, but externally, literally nothing at all, which was sort of very, very strange. And even Duesler noted years later that still kind of, was puzzling.
Let's shift gears here to talking about whistleblowers and UFO researchers. Of course, sometimes it turns out that the encounters or their interest in this topic turns out to be fatal as well. You don't have to be flying a plane and chasing a UFO to die. And the first one, and probably the most important one that you mentioned, is James Forrestal. Now, I've seen History Channel excerpts and different UFO shows that have taken this on and told a little bit of the history, but nothing with the kind of details and extra spin that you give this, including the Men in Black and then the CIA document. Let's talk about that for a couple of minutes. Who Forrestal was, why he was so important to this topic.
Well, yeah, sure. Well, James Forrestal sort of had the distinction of being the first ever U.S. Secretary of Defense, and he was given that position by President Harry Truman in 1947, which was a very interesting year. You know, Roswell, Maury Island, the creation of the CIA, passing of the National Security Act, all in 1947. Now, Forrestal was sort of an interesting and very complex character, and he was someone who was sort of deeply skilled in terms of, you know, in terms of the job that requirements. You know, he was the perfect person for it, but he's also a very sort of emotional person as well, which isn't necessarily the best person to have, you know, holding that position where you've got to make major strategic decisions, sometimes hard ones, on a daily basis. Now, there are long-standing stories within the UFO field that after becoming Secretary of Defense, that Forrestal was briefed by somebody within government who was sort of running the UFO program, and Forrestal was essentially given all the information that existed on the UFO issue. And by all accounts, he didn't sort of take the information very well. It clearly played on his mind, disturbed him, to the point where, over time, it almost sort of took him to the point of a complete psychological collapse, the sort of the dark and disturbing things he heard, and also the responsibility of having to sit on this information and not reveal it. Now, this all came to a head in early 1949, when Forrestal, as I said, pretty much did have an emotional collapse, and he was admitted to the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland and stayed there for a number of weeks, actually towards the end of May 1949. Now, just before he went into the hospital, he became very paranoid that his telephone was being monitored, his mail was being intercepted, people were watching him, and so forth. This actually coincided, 1952-51, when the Men in Black mystery really took off big time. And I mention this in the book because it's a very little-known aspect of the Forrestal story. But in the early 50s, the Men in Black would sort of typically look weird. They were often described as like 5 feet to 5 feet 5 tall, very strange features, very pale, anemic looking, and they would always travel in groups of 3. Well, there's a weird Men in Black type story involving Forrestal that just before he was admitted to the hospital, he was speaking with a friend at his house when there was a knock at the door, and one of Forrestal's staff answered the door, and it turned out it was sort of a strange looking guy who was looking to get Forrestal support for a program involving the local post office. And with hindsight, it seems like this was almost like a cover story to either destabilize Forrestal even further or to try and find a way into the house on the part of this creepy looking character. Well, Forrestal and his friend were actually watching all this going on through the windows, and as the guy left, he met up with 2 other characters, in other words, a group of 3, just like the Men in Black. And Forrestal came to think that this was sort of deliberately being done to try and intimidate him, and that may well have been the case, and it does have sort of very sort of creepy MIB overtones to it. But the most significant thing is what happened to him when he was taken to the hospital. As I said, he was taken there in 1949, and over the weeks he was in there, he actually made a very good recovery, to the point where the military man who was overseeing his room and just keeping an eye on him, Forrestal actually offered him a job as his personal chauffeur, and Forrestal was sort of looking after himself well, you know, shaving, showering, eating well, and clearly was coming out of this depressive state. Now,
he was hours away. He was hours away, right, from being released?
Yes, he was literally hours away. What happened was that his brother wanted to take him home to recover there. He thought he felt he'd have a better environment. But every time he found the hospital, he said that he would be given a different reason as to why Forrestal couldn't be released. And on the morning of May the 21st, 1949, Forrestal's brother phoned the hospital in a very angry state and essentially said, I'm coming to the hospital tomorrow morning, I'm going to take my brother home, and you can like it or you can like it not, but that's what's going to happen. Now, the story is that Forrestal, on his release, was planning to essentially reveal to the world everything that he knew about the UFO phenomenon. Now, bearing in mind that his brother phoned the hospital on the 21st, was going to take him home on the morning of the 22nd, if somebody wanted rid of Forrestal, the only time they could do it would be the night of the 21st or in the early hours of the 22nd. And that's exactly what happened, is that Forrestal did die in the early hours of the 22nd of May. And what happened was that, well, it depends on whose version of events you accept. He either fell, jumped, or was pushed from the 13th floor of the Bethesda Hospital, and he came crashing down on a third-floor canopy. And now, of course, you know, you're not going to survive a fall from 10 floors. You know, it's just impossible unless you're really, really lucky, and Forrestal wasn't lucky. And the official story is that he tied the sort of the sash or the rope from his dressing gown around his neck and the other end around the radiator, and then clambered out the window and essentially let himself go, and the weight of his body reportedly tore the sash, and he fell to his death. The official story is he supposedly tried to hang himself. But there are a lot of questions. For example, the sash around his waist was just big enough to go around his waist. But, you know, the official story is that it was long enough to allow it to tie around his neck and then around the radiator, and then actually to climb out of the window as well.
Yeah, that's a heck of a long cord. Gee.
Yeah, and lower himself down. And we know he lowered himself down because there are actually scratch marks on the window as if he'd been struggling to get back in. So it wasn't like, you know, he just fell straight out the window. He was clearly hanging, so that would be a substantial, you know, piece of cord. And so that in essence is the story. But one of the interesting things is that a few years ago a document surfaced again through the Freedom of Information Act from the CIA titled A Study of Assassination. And it was actually like a guideline document for CIA personnel on how to make a murder look like an accident or a suicide. And it mentions that the most profitable way of doing this is to essentially throw someone from a high building, and where there's like a, you know, they're going to fall on concrete. It talks about how, yes, a bridge can be a useful place to do it, but if it's, you know, if it's got a river running below it, there's always a chance the person could survive. So it actually talks about, you know, throwing the person from a multi-story building onto a, you know, a sidewalk or the pavement. So
I'll read a chunk of it.
It dates from early '52, so, you know, clearly that mode of death was mooted at that time, if you like.
Yeah, quoting from the document that's in your book, it says, and this is from the CIA, quote, for secret assassination, either simple or chase, the contrived accident is the most effective technique. When successfully executed, it causes little excitement and is only casually investigated. I mean, that's really chilling, the fact that the government or a government agency would put something like that on paper.
Well, yeah, and again, it sounds controversial, but as I said, it's a legitimate Freedom of Information document. There's nothing sort of, you know, questionable about the documents at all. And it actually surfaced, not by accident, but the document itself was contained within like a larger collection of documents that dealt with the CIA's involvement in Guatemala in 1954. And this was like a huge file, and it turns out that this assassination document was contained in that file. So if people actually hadn't sort of petitioned for the Guatemala files to surface, the chances are we would never have seen this document that was contained in there as well. But the Forrestal story, for me at least, is a fascinating one and a chilling one, because, you know, if somebody was willing to take out the Secretary of Defense, then clearly they're not going to think twice about your average UFO researcher. So in other words, it's the implications of the death that are important as well.
Tell me this, Nick. Do you think, we're jumping out of order here, but do you think that there would be an organization that would still enforce that kind of an edict that would need to? Or has the UFOs topic been so diluted by so much crap that they wouldn't need to do it anymore?
Well, yeah, no, that's actually a very good point, and I think this clearly only happens on limited occasions. It's not like UFO researchers dropping by the thousands. I think it's just certain cases where somebody may get a little bit too close or knows too much. But what I actually believe in terms of these murders, I truthfully don't believe it is anything specifically to do with the U.S. government. I don't think they're the parties involved at all. What I think is that there's some sort of like a shadow group, one that isn't answerable to Congress, that isn't overseen by congressional oversight, that is sort of black budget funded, and that, when the government says, look, we've looked for files on Roswell and we can't find anything, I'm one of these people who actually doesn't think they're lying. I think they're telling the truth, and I don't believe the U.S. government is going around killing UFO researchers at all, but I do think there's some sort of shadow group that may be like a multinational, very powerful organization to which the UFO program is almost like being privately siphoned off to.
I'm in agreement with that.
I think those are the people who could be behind it.
If there's recovered technology or parts or pieces, that they would have been transferred as well, have a buffer so nobody, people like you or I, couldn't get to them.
Yeah, and that's why. Yeah, I mean, I have people who said to me, "Oh, this is all the government, evil government." I'm not just saying this. I don't think it is. I think it is like a multinational, powerful group, and probably a lot of these deaths. Somebody's just hired, who's demonstrated in the past. They're good with a gun or whatever, and it's not the agencies who we think it is. It's almost like a non-existent body. That's dealing with the UFO phenomenon and all the offshoots from it as well.
I suppose if you could kill somebody like the Secretary of Defense, then it's not that much of a jump to, say, the President. A lot of speculation about whether JFK was ready to spill the beans about UFOs and whether that might have had something to do with his assassination. Nick, I've always sort of been on the sidelines of the discussion about whether JFK might have been killed in relation to UFOs. It seems like a stretch to some degree, maybe wishful thinking on the parts of some UFO researchers, but I think you raised some pretty interesting points that give it at least the framework of credibility. Talk about that. What do you think about it? Do you think it is related, or is it at least worth discussing?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think when people think of the Kennedy assassination and UFOs and then actually combining them into two, even for a lot of people in ufology, that's too much of a stretch. That's arguably the two biggest conspiracy theories in the world actually being part of one. But what is intriguing is that when we look into the Kennedy assassination, we actually do find a lot of UFO strands and themes. We mentioned at the start of the show the Maury Island case. Well, as I said, that when this strange wreckage was found at Maury Island, it was handed over to a man named Fred Chrisman. Chrisman was someone who had a very shadowy, weird background in the world of intelligence, and actually popped up in the Kennedy assassination 2 decades later, to the extent that Jim Garrison, who was the district attorney of New Orleans at the time, played by Kevin Costner in the JFK movie, Garrison actually came to believe that Chrisman was none other than one of the gunmen that shot Kennedy. On top of that, we have a guy named Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister was an FBI agent in the summer of 1947 who undertook a number of high-profile UFO investigations for the FBI at the time, and his documents have been, again, released officially. Bannister himself turns up in the Kennedy assassination. He was also portrayed in the JFK movie by Ed Asner, and both Chrisman and Bannister knew each other. They both were associated with Lee Harvey Oswald, and so you have a connection between two men involved in the formative years of ufology, Bannister and Chrisman, tied in with Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, one of the most fascinating things that I found, and again, this was sort of like with the Roswell thing, looking at not just the case itself, but what else was going on at the same time, was that one day before Kennedy was shot, he was killed on November 22nd, 1963. Well, on November 21st, Kennedy flew to Brooks Air Force Base in Texas, where he opened half a dozen new buildings that were dedicated to early research into what was termed space medicine. In other words, because this was the early years of the space race, so to speak, it wasn't really too well known as to what the long-term effects would be from exposure to low gravity and no gravity at all on the human body. You know, how would it affect bone structure and blood pressure and things like this? So that was one of the primary reasons for setting up this new project at Brooks Air Force Base. Now, it turns out that when Kennedy was at Brooks, bear in mind this was just 24 hours before his death, he had a behind-closed-doors meeting with a Major General Theodore Bedwell. And it turns out that Theodore Bedwell, in the summer of 1947, was actually the deputy surgeon at the Air Material Command at Wright Field, Ohio, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So, in other words, Bedwell worked in a medical capacity at Wright Field in the summer of 47 at the time when the alien bodies were reportedly brought in from Roswell. And his position would arguably have put him in a prime place to see those bodies. Now, it gets even more intriguing because in that very same visit to Brooks Air Force Base, Kennedy also had a meeting with a Colonel Harold Ellingson of the U.S. Air Force, who was actually the post surgeon and hospital commander at Fort Detrick, Maryland. And there have been a lot of stories about alien bodies and alien viruses being studied at Fort Detrick, and certainly somebody like the post surgeon and hospital commander at Fort Detrick might have been somebody who would have been brought into the program. The fact that Kennedy met both of these people just a day before he was killed, I find that intriguing as well. And the links don't stop there. Well, I guess one of the most controversial UFO books of the last few years, or the last 15 years or so, was Philip Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, Colonel Corso's book. A lot of people don't realize that Colonel Corso was actually a special investigator for Senator Richard Russell, who was on the Warren Commission. And Senator Russell, when in 1955 he went on a fact-finding mission to the Soviet Union, he actually had a very close UFO encounter. There's a document on his case now in the public domain, like a reporting file, and he was also briefed on the subject by the CIA afterwards, and that's just sort of like the tip of the threads that link the Kennedy assassination, with various aspects of the UFO phenomenon.
Richard Russell was also portrayed in JFK the movie. Walter Matthau, who was talking into the ear of the main character, the Jim Garrison character, and he told him about the Warren Commission, that dog don't hunt. So I think he was helpful to Jim Garrison, encouraged the investigation. What do you make of the stories about Marilyn Monroe, the Kennedy brothers having pillow talk and spilling the beans to Marilyn Monroe and Dorothy Kilgallen? Do you give that much credibility?
Well, again, when we look at the strands, it's interesting, even though it's a sensational story. Dorothy Kilgallen was a newspaper journalist and media personality. In 1955, she travelled to England on holiday with her husband and published a story shortly after her return to the US stating that she'd had a face-to-face meeting with a high-ranking British government official who told her that the British government had got its hands on a crashed UFO that was piloted by what she was told were, quote, small men. So she had an interest in the UFO phenomenon that definitely went back to 1955 and related to crashed UFOs. Now, there's an unofficial document in the public domain which is reportedly a CIA summary of a wiretap conversation between Dorothy Kilgallen and a mutual friend of Kilgallen's and Marilyn Monroe's, a man named Howard Rothberg. And the story is that Kilgallen and Rothberg were discussing how Marilyn Monroe had told both of them that she was sort of sick and tired of the way she'd been treated by the Kennedys, and that she was going to blow the whistle on all these various stories, so-called pillow talk secrets that Kennedy had told Marilyn Monroe. And this involved supposedly things like plans to invade Cuba and the then current relationship with the Soviet Union and so on. One of the stories supposedly related to after Kennedy was elected, that he was taken to a military base somewhere and showed the remains of a wrecked spacecraft and some unusual bodies. And the story was that because Marilyn Monroe was so fed up as the way she'd been treated, she was going to blow the whistle and do it quickly. Now, this particular document, which surfaced unofficially, I should stress, it didn't surface officially, it came from a man named Milo Spiriglio in the mid-90s who wrote 3 books on Marilyn Monroe's death. And he talks about how she was going to go public, etc., etc. And the document's actually dated like 3 days before she was found dead, under circumstances which still provoke a lot of controversy to this day. And he talks about her diary of secrets and what she was going to reveal as to what was contained in this diary. Now, it is a fact that she was like a prestigious keeper and writer of journals. You know, she's often sort of portrayed as this ditzy, crazy blonde, but off-screen she was, you know, she was very interested in world affairs, politics, poetry, and lots more. And apparently in this diary of secrets, it contained all this data that she'd been told. A number of people did confirm they saw this, particularly at the coroner's office after a body was taken in for autopsy. And the people who've spoken out on this all said that within like 48 hours, the diary had mysteriously vanished or had been confiscated. So that part of the story, it's pretty safe in saying that, you know, the existence of the journal can be vindicated. And Dorothy Kilgallen's interest in crashed UFOs can be vindicated as well, 7 years before she was speaking to Marilyn Monroe. Now, of course, the document itself hasn't been vindicated. It's still, you know, in that questionable grey area, so to speak. But in terms of when you add it to the rest of the story, you know, it does kind of add weight to it as well, I think.
You have we're never going to be able to cover all this, and we don't want to. We want people to check out your book, but you have so many different names of people who met weird ends. Morris Jessup and this guy out on the moors. But the one that really jumped out at me was Pat Price. I mentioned at the beginning of this program that the International Remote Viewing Association are meeting in Las Vegas this weekend, or out in Henderson, outside of Las Vegas. And, you know, I know a lot of those guys. They've spoken so highly of Pat Price, who was one of the first and the best of the remote viewers. But the details that you have in this book, I had never heard before. So tell us who Pat Price was, the kinds of stuff that he did with his abilities, and then what happened to him.
Well, yeah, I mean, Pat Price was one of the most respected so-called remote viewers, or psychic spies, if you like, in the 1970s. The 70s was the one era, I guess, more than any other, when remote viewing really came to the fore. The idea of using the power of the human mind, psychic phenomena, to spy on potential enemies like the Russians or the Chinese. And as I said, Pat Price was at the forefront of this. Interestingly, one of the things that Pat Price reportedly remote viewed were a number of underground installations where very human-like aliens existed, and he talked about Mount Zeal in Australia, another one in the Pyrenees Mountains somewhere on the border of France and Spain.
One in Alaska?
Yeah, one also in Alaska. So in other words, reportedly all around the world. Now, the most controversial aspect of Pat Price's life, ironically, is possibly his death. This gets into sort of very weird areas. It actually occurred in Las Vegas. He checked into the Stardust Hotel, and several weird things happened. He mentioned to friends that just the previous evening, when he was in Washington, D.C., prior to flying out to Las Vegas, that somebody slipped something into his cup of coffee. Fortunately, he actually saw the person doing this, and so he didn't drink the coffee. Now, when he got to the hotel, he actually collided with another man in the lobby, and he didn't really give that much thought at that particular time. But in the early hours late that night, he started to feel ill, and in the early hours of the morning, he got sicker and sicker. And it was actually on that day that he died, and it was actually put down to heart disease. Now, one of the things I point out is that the whole issue of this guy colliding with Price in the hotel lobby, and then Price falling sick afterwards, is actually eerily similar to something that happened in England, where I grew up, back in 1978, involving a man named Georgy Markov, who actually defected. Excuse me, he was a defector from Bulgaria, and what happened was that he was actually stabbed in the back of the leg by someone with an umbrella, and it was actually put down to an accident at the time. But it was found on his autopsy when he died that Markov had actually been stabbed with a fatal poison. And this sounds very similar potentially to this situation with Pat Price, that it almost sounds like two attempts were made on his life, one with somebody slipping something into the coffee which didn't work, and then possibly with this collision in the lobby that only hours later then he began to fall sick. And it's a very very strange story that sounds like somebody wanted to get rid of him.
When you hear him say, as a remote viewer, I psychically see alien bases under a couple of mountains, it sounds pretty wacky. But we should point out, as you do in the book, that he had uncovered stuff that he wasn't supposed to know. I mean, he discovered they had tasked him to look for one thing, and he found something else, secret NSA facilities. And when NSA or CIA or both found out that he knew about them, they were very upset.
Yeah, they were. I mean, on the one hand, this, demonstrates his skills, but I think on the other hand, you're quite right that no one really anticipated the sheer extent of his ability to sort of psychically penetrate not just overseas facilities, but classified internal facilities as well. And I think because he was perceived as arguably the leading remote viewer of the time, it's not surprising that someone would have wanted to get rid of him. Now, one of the more controversial theories is that, he was actually assassinated by extraterrestrials purely and simply because he'd uncovered this sort of network of underground installations, not just sort of in the US, but around the entire planet. And, you could make a good argument, or you could ask the question, had he not been killed, how much further would he have gone with this remote viewing investigation of potential underground installations with a UFO connection? Maybe that had something to do with his death.
I would think the KGB would have wanted him dead. If they somehow found out about his abilities, they would have wanted him dead for sure. And I'm not sure, he might have been too much of a threat for CIA and NSA, figuring, gosh, a guy like that, who knows what beans he might spill.
Well, yeah, I mean, the KGB is actually a good candidate because I mentioned the death of Georgy Markov in 1978 in London. Well, that was supposedly done, as I said, by the Bulgarian secret police. However, they worked very closely with the Soviet KGB, and there have been stories that it could have been like a joint operation. So, this was just 3 years after Pat Price, 75 to 78. So, I think the Soviets could be a good candidate as well.
We've got just a couple of minutes here. I wanted to touch on the guy, the MK Ultra guy, if you can tell that story in about 3 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Well, this is a guy named Frank Olson who fell to his death or was pushed, very similar fashion to that of James Forrestal in 1959. And Frank Olson was someone who was heavily involved in the early 50s in the MK Ultra program of sort of mind manipulation and mind control, as it's become sort of popularly known. And the reason I mention this in the book is because over the years there have been various allegations that some UFO events may have been sort of staged events to try and determine how far the mind can really be manipulated by seeing if people can sort of fall for fake UFO events. Now, the important thing I should stress is this doesn't mean there aren't real UFOs. There clearly are. But the idea is that, sort of LSD and mind-altering drugs have been used to try and stage UFO events and see how far they can go. But Frank Olson was someone who was heavily involved with both the military and the intelligence community in terms of new concepts and so forth in mind control. And the story is sort of highly controversial, mainly because of his death, which occurred in 1953, in November 1953, when he actually fell from the Manhattan Statler Hotel from the 10th floor, and like Forrestal, died. Now, there are actually a number of key events that link Olson with the UFO phenomenon. For example, one of the most intriguing ones is that some of the operations that he was involved in occurred at a place called Horn Island in Mississippi. This was actually only a couple of miles, and this was a mind-altering chemical weaponry was tested. One of them, a drug called BZ, which could have sort of bizarre and graphic hallucinogenic effects on people. This actually, the place where this was undertaken was literally only a couple of miles from where one of the most famous abduction events occurred in the early 70s, involving Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker at a place called Pascagoula, where they underwent a very strange abduction experience. But when we find that BZ was actually being tested just literally down the road from there, that kind of makes me wonder if there was a tie-in with that particular case as well.
I'll tell you, Nick, we'll take a break. We'll continue our conversation about your new book, Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind, including the string of scientists that died mysteriously. And then we'll open up the phone lines with questions. I know there are a lot of them from our listeners. Nick, I wanted to give you a chance to wrap up the story about the MK Ultra guy, unless you're about done with that one.
No, that's fine. Yeah, this is Frank Olson, who was one of the major players in the MK Ultra mind control, mind manipulation project that kicked off in the early 1950s. And as I said before the break, Olson was someone who mixed with people in the UFO field almost as easily as he did people in the mind control angle as well. Now, as I talked about before the break, the controversial theory is that some UFO events may have been fabricated using sort of mind-altering technologies born out of MK Ultra. And as I said, the significant thing is that Olson was actually linked with various people in the UFO subject. Now, one of them was a man named Andrija Puharic, who was someone who was actually an American of Yugoslavian descent, and who claimed to have been contacted by extraterrestrials. And he had something called the Round Table Foundation in Glen Cove, Maine. But Puharic was actually also a captain in the U.S. Army at the Edgewood, Maryland-based Army Chemical Center, where a lot of the MK Ultra research was carried out.
He's always also, I'm sorry to interrupt, but he was also played a major role in the Uri Geller story.
Exactly. And Frank Olson met with Puharic on a number of occasions to discuss his work in the field of chemical technology in terms of mind manipulation and the UFO subject as well. And there's another story about how in 1954 there was a wave of very strange UFO sightings in France. It coincides with the fact that just a couple of years earlier, Frank Olson had been in that very area of France discussing with French intelligence agents how the mind could be manipulated and altered, because the French government was interested in this as well. And then it's kind of intriguing. We have this outbreak of UFO activity in that very same area. So we have a lot of things like this. As I point out, the before the break, if people who might not have heard it, the Pascagoula case of 1973 involving two men in an abduction, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. Their experience occurred just a couple of miles from a place where BZ, a highly hallucinogenic substance, was tested. So we have again the strands of what I think potentially could turn out to be a much bigger story.
In that same vein, I remember reading about this string of scientific deaths, Marconi Electric Systems. In fact, it might be more than one company associated with a string of deaths, but this is the one that you mentioned in Chapter 10 of your book. What kind of work were these guys doing, and why would you classify their deaths as mysterious?
Well, they're all good questions. It all goes back to the early 1980s when President Ronald Reagan, envisaged the whole Strategic Defense Initiative program, as he called it, or SDI, or as it was more famously known, Star Wars. And the idea was, it was a very grand and ambitious program where we would have like a huge laser-based armada orbiting in near-Earth orbit. So in the event that the Russians or the Chinese launched a sneak nuclear attack, these laser-based weapons could actually just obliterate and blast out of the sky, disintegrate any potential nuclear weapons launched by somebody else at the US. Now, the program, as I said, was a very grand and visionary one, but it may not have sort of reached the potential that the president perceived that potentially it could. Now, this coincided with Reagan making a number of public statements on the UFO subject and talking about how if, there was some sort of alien invasion, it would unite us as a species. And you can find many of these lectures online. They're actually filmed, and he does make these comments on a number of occasions. Clearly, to me, it seems like he was trying to get the word out, so to speak. Well, bear in mind the SDI work and Reagan talking about hostile aliens. Marconi, an English company that which is now actually incorporated into another company today, but does a lot of high-level work for the British Ministry of Defence and the British Royal Air Force, the military, etc., on weapon systems and things like that. Marconi was actually contracted to work extensively on the SDI program from varying different disciplines. And what's intriguing is that between 1982 and 1991, no less than 31 scientists and personnel working for Marconi, many on the SDI angles, died under mysterious circumstances. And by mysterious circumstances, I mean out-of-the-blue suicides, jumping off bridges, car crashes where, in one case, for example, a man just had normal life and then just one day just loaded the trunk of his car with gasoline tanks, hit the highway and slammed into a deserted cafe at like 80 miles an hour and just blew himself up. Another one put a rope around his neck, tied the other end around a lamppost, got in his car and hit the accelerator and decapitated himself. There are others who electrocuted themselves in very bizarre fashions. Another one actually died from carbon monoxide poisoning in his car when he was supposedly cleaning the car inside the garage with the door shut, which is a bizarre thing to do.
That same guy had almost died earlier, right?
Well, that's one of the very strange things, that the same guy almost died in a car accident just months earlier. And it was a very weird car accident where he couldn't figure out how it had happened. And there was actually some talk that privately he told family and friends it was as if something had taken control of his mind and had almost forced him to crash the car. But he he prevented that from happening, only to die, as I said, in his garage weeks later. Now, a controversial theory for all this surfaced from a man named Gordon Crichton, whose story I tell in the book. Gordon Crichton was a former editor of Flying Saucer Review magazine, a long-standing journal going back to the 50s, but he was also a former intelligence officer with the British military. He came to believe or suspect that the intelligence behind the UFO phenomenon was actually using a kind of mind control to wipe out the SDI scientists. In other words, if SDI, as some people believe, wasn't just aimed at targeting the Russians or the Chinese, but some people believed it was actually targeting hostile extraterrestrials, hence Reagan's warnings, the theory is that the extraterrestrials themselves decided to turn the tables by wiping out the SDI scientists. And it has to be said that there is evidence that mind control did play a role in some of these deaths and bizarre events. Aside from this one, where the guy survived one near-death experience only to then, have a fatal one, there was another case where one of the scientists found himself wandering around France. He lived in England, but found himself, of all places, wandering around France in a haze, in a daze, not even sure how he got there, as if some sort of hypnotic spell had been, sort of instilled in him. And there are a number of cases like that, and as I said, there are more than 30 between 82 and 91. And on such a scale, for me at least, coincidence goes out the window, but the British government stubbornly refused to suggest there was anything to it beyond accidents, heart attacks, depression, and so on. But when you look at the overall picture, clearly there was more going on than that. And I think Gordon Crichton's scenario of mind control actually being undertaken by hostile aliens to prevent the SDI program going ahead, it's sort of a fascinating and disturbing one at the same time.
Well, the odds of more than 30 guys working in that one little sector of the defense industry on the same kind of project, the odds would be off the charts.
Well, you're right.
And then you add in a case like you had one instance where a guy, he eventually died. He killed himself. The guy was in with the engine running and the garage door shut. But a year earlier, he almost killed himself when he was cleaning his gun while it was loaded.
Yeah, this is another case with a Marconi guy. Died in his garage from carbon monoxide poisoning, but just a few months earlier, he'd already been cleaning his gun when it was still loaded, and he'd actually pointed at his chest and shot himself, and fortunately survived. But he, afterwards, was sort of chilled to the bone. He actually said he couldn't figure out how his mind could have got into such a state where he would have cleaned the gun while it was loaded and pointed at him. Very, very strange. And although I don't mention this in the book, this really kind of parallels the deaths of dozens of microbiologists around the world, many in the U.S. since early 2001, who've been studying exotic viruses and so on. They've kind of dropped like flies, just like the Marconi scientists as well.
You make the point in the book, too, about these Marconi guys, is that not only were they dying off in strange circumstances, but there was also a series of UFO events. I mean, some people tried to explain them away as maybe the IRA had helicopters, which seemed to be a bit of a stretch that they had silent helicopters, but, for the sake of argument, I guess we can include it, but there were at least a couple of intrusions over the Marconi facility, right?
Yeah, I talk about this in the book, where I actually reproduce one of the documents from the British police force that talks about these, as they call them, sort of phantom helicopters or mystery helicopters, because they didn't really know what they were. But they were essentially unidentified flying objects seen over key Marconi installations. And, I don't think that's a coincidence, because one of the installations was the very one where this guy who shot himself in the chest was actually working, and in the same time frame. And so I think there's a major story here on the Marconi scientists that we've really only seen the tip of. We know of the deaths. What we don't know is all the background information and what the government itself may have known or suspected that possibly could have been along the lines of Gordon Crichton, sort of like an alien assassination, so to speak.
Oh, man, that'd be a great movie. But it's sad for the families of the people that happened to. We'll take a call or two, and then I have a ton of more questions. East of the Rockies, Bonnie in Florida. Good morning, Bonnie. You're on with Nick Redfern.
Good morning, George and Mr. Redfern. My husband was a roommate with Thomas Mantell when they were both cadets in the Air Force.
Oh, my gosh.
And he told me about this, and he said that Thomas Mantell was an extremely intelligent, good pilot, and that he would never do anything stupid. And actually, the story that I had heard previous to the time I met my husband was that this UFO was hanging over Fort Knox for like a week or two. And so they didn't know what to think about it. So somebody, I don't know who, maybe the government or somebody, asked Mantell, he and his group were ferrying planes from someplace. They were together, and they came in, and somebody asked him to check out the UFO that had been there. So he said yes, he would. So several of the fellows went along, but some of them turned back because they thought they didn't have enough fuel or something. And Mantell, being the brave person that he was, he chased after it. So evidently something happened to him then. But my husband knew his wife before they were married. Her name was Peggy, and he said that there was another one of their roommates who later became an attorney, and he helped Peggy try to collect the insurance for Tommy's death because they couldn't prove how he died. Now, I had a picture of my husband and Mantell together, and I had it enlarged, and I sent a copy to his son, whose address I had at one time. I think he lived in Kentucky at the time. And so I've lost the picture. I don't know where it disappeared to. But I thought it was an interesting story because my husband had known Mantell, and that was long before I met him. But he said he was a very intelligent, super good pilot.
Wow, Bonnie, that's a great call. Good information. Nick?
Yeah, that's excellent. Thanks, Bonnie. That sort of vindicates what so many other people have said, that, contrary to the idea that Mantell just openly mistook Venus for a UFO, which in the middle of the day when Venus really wouldn't have been in view is sort of absurd. And this goes back to the fact that Mantell was a highly trained and well-respected observer and pilot. And in that sense, this just adds to it. When you get corroboration like this from somebody like your husband who knew him personally, then that, for me, is the sort of thing we always go looking for as a UFO researcher, is where, you can actually add something really significant to the story.
Thank you for the call, Bonnie. I mentioned earlier in the show about Edward Ruppelt, who was the head of Blue Book, and he sort of had an interesting transformation, or actually a couple of them. He investigated the Mantell case. He said, you quote, I forget what the exact words were in the book, but about it being weasel words, how the Mantell case was explained. Ruppelt, who was sort of an apologist for Blue Book, he went along with the program for a while, changed his mind, and then changed his mind again. And then, as you note, he died under somewhat mysterious circumstances. Tell us that part of the story.
Well, yeah, Ruppelt was the first head of Project Blue Book, as it was known. He actually was a successor to Project Sign and the previous one called Project Grudge, which actually Ruppelt also worked on Grudge as well. But it was really with Blue Book that he came to the forefront. And he was someone who sort of took an enthusiastic and proactive approach to the subject, and actually came to believe that, some UFOs were genuinely probably extraterrestrial, and he wrote a book called The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, which is a fascinating study when you realize it's actually been written by somebody in the military. Now, you're quite right, George, that after a few years he changed his views and became a little bit more jaded on the subject, and in future editions of the book his views were sort of modified and altered. And it is a fact that in 1960 he died of a heart attack at just 37. It was actually his second heart attack. Now, unfortunately, you do sometimes find people die of heart disease at a young age. Maybe that's what happened, but then on the other hand, maybe it isn't. We just don't know. But what we can say for sure is that this was another person who, a major high-profile figure within the UFO history, who died young.
At least the story I had heard, I've got copies of that first book, and it's a masterpiece, He was very sympathetic. This is a legitimate topic. There are real mysteries at work here. And then he sort of did an about-face in the later versions of it and kind of downplayed the whole thing. And the stories we've heard is that he was about to do another one, another about-face, and return to his pro-UFO position, and that's when he died. I don't know if that's consistent with what you've heard or not.
Well, yeah, Skip, I've heard those rumors, and, again, it shows the sort of, the smoke and mirrors side of things, where clearly there are things going on in the background where we're not seeing the full picture. But I do find it intriguing that Ruppelt did have this sort of back and forth approach to the subject, and there have been rumors that pressure may have been put on him to sort of retract his fairly startling, open view on the subject to one that was more skeptical. And, maybe that had some bearing on the overall outcome as well.
We barely have touched on the mutilations subject. You mentioned it just in passing earlier. If we get time, we'll jump into that because it's one of the most chilling parts of your book. The new book is Close Encounters of the Fatal Kind. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll go back to the phones. Got a couple of people hanging on, and then touch on a couple of other cases that you mentioned in this book, and it's way more than we can cover in the course of a couple hours. But good stuff here with my guest, Nick Redfern. Stay with us. Welcome back to our final segment with Nick Redfern. We go back to the phones on the wildcard line. Mihilo in Los Angeles. Good morning. You're on with Nick.
Good morning. How are you?
Okay.
Thank you for taking my call. This is really not a question, but I have a piece of information, possibly, for Mr. Redfern. I haven't read his book, but I knew Dorothy Kilgallen and her husband, Dick Colmar, and their son when I was teaching the son at boarding school in Phoenix, Arizona, called Jasper School. And they had a radio program in the morning called Dick and Dorothy. It was a breakfast program, and it issued from their brownstone on 67th Street in Manhattan. And she died under mysterious circumstances just after the assassination of Kennedy. Nobody ever knew. It was diagnosed as cancer. Now, she was perfectly healthy. And all of a sudden, she died of cancer. So I just wondered if he had that piece of information, and I think it's a small but interesting sidelight.
Oh.
She knew quite a bit about what was going on. She was very knowledgeable and quite a personality. She wrote for the New York World Telegram, which was then, there were very few papers, but that was one of the newspapers that was extant at the time.
Oh, yeah, she was a major figure, very popular across the country. Nick?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's very interesting, and you're quite right that she did die under very questionable circumstances, and it just sort of adds to the catalogue of unusual deaths that surround the Kennedy assassination. And although she was sort of primarily portrayed as, she took part in a lot of game shows and was a gossip columnist, she was actually a very skilled investigative journalist as well. It wasn't just sort of lightweight Hollywood gossip, although that was what she was more well known for. She was actually sort of a very good journalist, and I actually got hold of her FBI file, which runs to nearly 200 pages and is filled with copies of her articles that intrigue the FBI and again demonstrates her skill as a regular journalist.
I think she was really good because she had good contacts. Mihilo, she was well connected, right?
Yes, I think that's the best way of putting it. She was connected pretty high up.
Thank you for the call. I appreciate it. Go ahead, Nick.
No, well, I was just going to add that, in terms of the overall story, this is sort of just, another piece of the puzzle, and I think the more pieces we get, one day we're going to get there, hopefully.
Thank you for the call. Appreciate it. We didn't touch on this, but you only briefly, human mutilations. The evidence is not as solid, I think, for these cases as in other parts of your book, but you do touch on this, and it is at least intriguing.
Yeah, well, I felt it was an important issue to touch on, George, because people have spoken about human mutilations, kind of similar to the so-called cattle mutilations. And the main reason I wanted to include this was to see if it would, open further doors if people read the book and have knowledge of it. But the human mutilation cases are certainly less than the cattle mutilation ones, which sort of literally run into the thousands. But the reports are very similar in terms of organs being removed and sexual organs, eyeballs, tongues, lips, that kind of thing. The stories are pretty grisly. I talk about one that reached Leonard Stringfield, who was a long-time UFO researcher, but also a former U.S. Air Force intelligence officer. And he was given a story from Cambodia at the height of the Vietnam War in 1972. This was April 72, when reportedly a team of U.S. military personnel came across a landed UFO surrounded by a number of what were clearly alien creatures, reportedly loading human bodies and body parts into these large bins and then supposedly loading them onto the UFO. Now, granted, it's a controversial story, but Stringfield went on record as stating that it came from not just a friend, but someone who was a high-ranking military source that he trusted implicitly. And he didn't reveal his name, unfortunately, but Stringfield said that he had no doubts about the person and as a result didn't doubt the story. And I think one of the major problem with the human mutilation issue is that it's very much under-investigated. Don Ecker did some good research on the subject in the late 80s and early 90s, but overall it's been, I won't say it's been ignored, it's just, I think, it's gone under most people's radar. A lot of people just don't realize it's a legitimate phenomenon, but I think, more digging, we might be surprised at what we turn up.
I remember Don Ecker, who's a friend and colleague, and a hard-nosed investigator. He had a case, I think it was in Idaho. You mentioned that in the book.
Oh, yeah.
As I recall, yeah. A couple of hunters who found a body or something?
Yeah, you're right. This was actually it was between Bliss and Jerome, Idaho, in 1979, and it was two hunters. They came across the body of a man who was dead under very weird circumstances. He didn't look like he'd been sort of attacked by a bear or a mountain lion. It looked like expertise, skills had been used, if that's the right word, skills. He was missing both of his lips, one ear, and his sexual organs, and it looked like it had all been done with surgical precision. And, when you have rogue cases like that, it really does sort of push the subject down a very sort of sinister path.
Well, if you were wondering why there's no disclosure or why somebody doesn't come forward, maybe that's part of it. And it's not only an occasional mutilation here or there, but you got a heck of a lot of disappearances if you cast a wide enough net.
Yeah, and I think, if you look at the overall angle of UFO disclosure, I think, I support the people who are really doing the research into this and pushing to get disclosure.
Yep.
But I think, I often think that not much thought's given to what might actually be disclosed beyond the fact that aliens exist and maybe we've got a few bodies and crashed UFOs. The bigger issue of missing people, deaths, human mutilations, when the door is opened, if it is opened, I think some people may have wonder if we should have left the door shut. I think we should know the truth, but I think there could well be a lot of dark and disturbing things that come along beyond just, yes, we are being visited.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I mean, I fully believe in it. I strive for it. I work for it every day. But you know what? If the truth comes out that we are food or we're a farm, I'm not sure that people really are going to be ready for disclosure.
No, and I think this is the main issue that. If it was just that we'd had a few weird visits back in the 40s and something crashed, but they didn't attack us, now we've decided to tell you. I could see it coming out under those circumstances, but I think my personal view, speaking to people, is that something about the subject that's very disturbing has been learnt and a decision has been taken. There's just no way we can tell people that, you know.
We're on the same page. Going to Dave in Pittsburgh on the wild card line. Good morning, Dave. You're on with Nick Redfern.
Hello, I'm a first-time caller, but veteran of Coast to Coast since Art Bell.
Welcome.
I could tell you a bunch of my UFO experiences, but since you're talking about the mysterious scientist passed away, well, there was one that I don't know if you mentioned it before, but he was the lead singer for Aaron Butterfly, which his father was a physicist, and so was he. But he developed a way to send a message to outer space and back at a quick time, and all of a sudden he came up missing, and they found him in a desert in California. Well, they found his bones, actually. And
Iron Butterfly, what was his name? Do you remember his name?
I'm not sure what his name was, but he was the lead singer for Iron Butterfly. I'm going to say his first name was Doug, but I'm not sure. And I thought I heard Art Bell speak about this years ago.
Nick, does this ring a bell?
Yeah, it actually does. I don't know the full details, but the story was definitely written up in a UFO magazine a few years ago, and he was found dead, and he did have a tie to the UFO phenomenon, and it was an unusual story. But I'm sure, you know, if you put it into a search engine, you know, you'll find it. But yeah, there were some UFO themes to the whole story. Yeah.
Appreciate the call, Dave. That would be pretty interesting if the lead singer of Iron Butterfly was a physicist, or his dad, even if his dad was the physicist. I'll throw out another name, Nick. You don't mention this in the book, but I know that it's a name that I get asked about all the time because of the possible connection to Area 51. It's Phil Schneider. Are you familiar with him? Because a lot of people say that the circumstances of his death, and I haven't investigated them, were pretty strange.
Yeah, the only reason people ask me if I include Schneider's case in the book, I don't, and not for any reason other than the fact that contractually I was limited to 65,000 words. I could not exceed that. I could have actually made the book like 90,000, but that's just one of those things. So, you know, I was forced to, you know, to leave certain things out that I could have actually put in. But Schneider's death, I mean, was a very weird one. You know, but the interesting thing about Schneider was he was actually speaking quite openly about the Dulce story, Dulce, New Mexico, and the claims of underground installations and, you know, hostile extraterrestrials, and a lot of it tied in with the Paul Benowitz story that surfaced in the late 1970s with, again, with cattle mutilations and an underground facility at Dulce, New Mexico. And Schneider, you know, his death was put down to suicide, but when you look into the intricacies of it, it doesn't appear to be a suicide at all. And that's interesting because, I mean, in terms of when it occurred, it's relatively recently. You know, we're talking 1990s. We're not talking, you know, 1940s or 50s. What this demonstrates is that things are potentially still going on in terms of, you know, unusual suicides, suspicious deaths, and so on. I think I've seen a trend where I don't think there are as many today as there were in the past, and I think that could well be because, as you pointed out earlier, George, how the subject's been diluted and sensationalized and so on, that there's no need anymore. And I think that's an interesting trend, that perhaps in the early years there would be more of motivation than there would be today, when it's become more part of popular culture and filled with disinformation and, unfortunately, hoaxes and whatever else.
Well, you know, your theme, I mean, you do cast a wide net, but there's a temptation, I think, in the UFO field to ascribe every death to, he must have died because the evil secret government killed him. Yeah. Bill Cooper is an example. I mean, you know, Bill Cooper, I was the first guy to interview him on television, and I know how he died, and he sort of brought this on himself, but I mean, it wasn't because he was spilling beans on UFOs that he was killed. There is the risk of thinking anyone who's ever studied the subject who dies, it must be because of what they knew.
Yeah, and I point this out in the book, but, I was very careful as to what cases I used and which ones I didn't. And the most important thing is to note that, over the decades, there have been literally probably tens of thousands of people who've had an interest in the subject that's involved research or subscribing to journals or, signing up with MUFON or whoever, writing books, etc., etc. And they've lived perfectly normal lives. And I think there is a trend to these deaths, and I think it's where someone, if you look at the death of Forrestal and JFK, if the UFO connections to their deaths are legitimate, they would have been people in a prime position to reveal something of major significance. And I think there are other people, certain researchers, who may have been in a similar position as well, and like Morris Jessup. And I think it's those cases where somebody may have decided there was no alternative but to ensure that they didn't say anything again about anything at all. And on top of that, I think there are also certain cases where, for example, we talked about this sort of silent war that may have gone on back in the 50s, where there was literally, so many aircraft disappearances and mysterious crashes that that's the reason we don't really see that anymore today, because I think the engagement has gone away. We've kind of got the message to stay away. So I think, that in terms of which deaths are suspicious and which ones aren't, we need to be sort of very careful. Somebody actually asked why I didn't include the death of a friend of mine, Mac Tonis, who wrote a book called The Crypto-Terrestrials a few years ago, and one on the face on Mars called After the Martian Apocalypse. Mac died in his sleep at just 34 in 2009. Well, the reason I didn't include it was because Mac actually had heart disease. He had a number of experiences of faintings and dizziness a long time before he actually died, and he was trying to get treatment and so on, and then unfortunately he did die. So it's kind of like very occasionally, unfortunately, you see a footballer die on the pitch or during training, at 25 or something. It happens, and we're all human, and UFO researchers are human first, and sometimes a death is just a tragic death. But I think you're quite right, George, that a lot of people assume if there's a death in ufology, it's got to be sinister, but for the most part, they're not.
Well, we all go. We all go at one point, yeah. Try to get one more quick call in. East of the Rockies, Jonathan in Atlanta. Good morning. You're on with Nick. You got about a minute.
Evening, gentlemen. James Forrestal's death definitely seems sinister. And did he ever speak out publicly about UFOs? And if so, what did he say?
Well, he actually didn't speak out publicly about UFOs, but what is interesting is sort of the time frame of when he was Secretary of Defense. For example, Forrestal actually began working in the Pentagon on September the 23rd, 1947. That happened to be the same day that General Nathan Twine of the Air Force prepared one of the most now famous UFO reports or documents on UFOs, in which he said the phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. Now, 24 hours after that, September the 24th, Forrestal met with not just President Truman, but a man named Dr. Vannevar Bush, who has been extensively linked with sort of secret UFO programs. And so, in other words, we do have like a timeline where Forrestal was mixing with key figures in the UFO field as it relates to the government. And so although he didn't speak out publicly, we can place him with the right people at the right time.
Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate it. Nick, we've got just a little bit of time. You've not had the knock at the door. My general feeling is that, the UFO topic has been so diluted by so much overload that there really isn't a whole lot of danger in talking about this stuff anymore, that whoever the bad guys are, they don't really care if you write a book or if I do a radio broadcast about it. Do you agree?
Yeah, I actually do, because, those of us who sort of report on it and talk about it, we're sort of on the outside looking in. I think the people who in the past at least had to worry were the ones on the inside who were thinking of coming out, like Forrestal, possibly like JFK, and also people like Morris Jessup who stumbled on something that may well have, led to his untimely death. But yeah, I think in today's world of where ufology has now become part of pop culture, and on top of that it's been diluted, like you said, it's a case probably more that we kept an eye on, I would think, but not to the extent, where it takes on sinister proportions.
I'm gleeful in my agreement with you. Nick Redfern's always good to have you on the show.